and with UMass Boston. Really proud, and honored and really excited, to be, embarking upon this collaboration with these great universities. Um, this panel that we're going to showcase to you today was actually inspired by, the collaboration, the spirit of the collaboration. I felt, we needed to engage a part of Africa that illustrated, a collaboration among Mexico, the United States, and Africa, right? And how much better than Lusophone Africa. A bit of a paradox because I know that Lusophone Africa is an ethno-linguistic cultural subregion of Africa that is Portuguese speaking and not Spanish speaking. But all the same, it does, reflect, you can see my map there, which is the transnational, sort of Lusophones, Spanish speaking connections with, the study of Africa. So we're really excited about bringing you this panel that we are calling Lusophone Africa, Transnationalisms, Movements, and New Human Securities. Like I said, this does embody and symbolize our collaboration. Lusophone Africa is a cultural linguistic subregion, sort of politically organized by, PALOP, which includes, Equatorial Guinea, the only Spanish-speaking, country within, that, compact. These are countries that share a history of Portuguese settlement, Portuguese colonization, post-colonialism, and decolonization. A lot of panelists have spoken about decolonization today. But these processes inform the transformative political, economic, social, and cultural landscape of this region of Africa in respect to contemporary globalization. Our objectives today is to examine these dual, transformations unraveling the region in the millennium. We're looking at the region's transnational relations among each other in the context of the so-called Lusophone transatlantic matrix that I have behind me, defined as an interconnectedness of the region through the experience of the Portuguese imprint on these and on other African nations. We will examine the other transformation that looks at Lusophone Africa's international and global relations with the Lusophone world, including Portugal, but now so much more Brazil, Mexico's neighbor, as well as with other Spanish-speaking countries in Latin America, and especially with Mexico. And finally, papers will examine Lusophone Africa's current political and social movements, the human rights, human securities, democratic transitions, and foreign policies. So we have a star-studded panelist, full of scholars from all over the world. They are both Lusophone African scholars as well as scholars who study Lusophone Africa. Their bios are richly, documented for you in our program, and I hope you get a hand of it. It's posted. But I will just, name who they are and their institutions, and the great presentations that they're going to provide us today. First, we have Abel Djassi Amado, who is an assistant professor at Simmons University, locally here in Boston. And his paper will be named The Portuguese Language in Africa, a Void Power. And he has a question mark. Then we have our own Anna Mester, who is an associate professor, at University of Massachusetts, Boston. And the name of her paper will be called The Concentration Camp of Tarrafal, Carceral Islands and Archipelagos in Lusophone Africa. Third, we will have our own Aminah Pilgrim, who is also here at UMass Boston. She is a senior lecturer, and her panel, her paper is called Fighting for Gender Justice, from Pre-Independence to Poderoza. And finally, we have the great José Cossa, who joins us as a visitor from Pennsylvania State University, University Park, and the name of his paper will be called A Profile of Eduardo Chivambo Mondlane, Demystification, or mere, he asked the question, reflection on his interactions in the United States of America. So 4 great panelists. We have lots of time, folks, 20 minutes each, okay? And then we'll have lots of time for some really, I think, great dialogue. Okay, so let us start with Abel Amado.
Thank you, Kiki, and thank you, the organizers, for inviting me to this great transnational meeting on African studies. I'm going to share my PowerPoint to guide you with some of the comments I'm going to make today. So bear with me for a second. So with this presentation, I want to basically focus on 3 main points. First and foremost, I want to problematize this very concept that Kiki talked about. It was on the program, and it has a lot of currency, particularly in the United States, the whole concept of Lusophone Africa. So I think that it is important to discuss that concept, and as we'll see in a moment. My paper per se focuses on 2 dimensions of language planning. So it is a paper of political linguistics, meaning that we're going to look at how different actors, political actors, react and tend to shape language planning in African states with Portuguese as the official language. So my focus will be on these African states with Portuguese official language. So even though this language planning is way beyond these 5 African states, Angola, Cabo Verde, Guinea-Bissau, São Tomé e Príncipe, and Mozambique, but I want to focus on those 5 states, particularly with the 2 big Portuguese speaking African states, or I should say African states with the Portuguese as official language. So the approach, obviously, it's going to be international political linguistics. So, but let me just very briefly go to this very issue of Lusophone African and Lusophone. As Kiki mentioned, the term itself entails a given idea. It's a lingual name for Portuguese speaking, as was mentioned. Like any other term, particularly when it gets into politics, it has an ideological substratum, if you will, which we need to uncover. When we say Lusophone Africa, we are essentially placing Portuguese at the center of social experience in these states, which itself is problematic, besides the fact of revealing an urban bias. As we know, Portuguese it's widely used in urban areas in Mozambique, in Angola, Cabo Verde, Guinea-Bissau, but not so much in the rural areas. So by emphasizing or by bringing this concept, we are excluding a significant portion of people in these countries. Moreover, there is already a concept with a long history, and that concept was devised, designed, and implemented by Africans themselves. So there is one concept, obviously, it's in Portuguese, the acronym PALOP, which translates something like African countries with Portuguese as the official language. And I believe that that term best captures the social political reality of the states, because it becomes clear that the Portuguese has a given function in this society. It is the language of officialdom. While, it makes clear that the term itself refers to the states, not so much of the nations, not so much of the people. So PALOP, which is a term that I prefer, I think captures the social-linguistic reality of the states better than Lusophone. Moreover, the term itself, Lusophone, I want to suggest could easily be understood as global North conceptual imperialism. The term was coined by David Birmingham, a famous British historian of Angola. Nonetheless, it has a lot of currency in the global North academia. But you go to Angola or Mozambique or in Cabo Verde and Guinea-Bissau, very few people use that term Lusophone Africa. When they're talking about those 5 countries, they use the term PALOP. So we need to bring the term from the global South into the global North academia. And the last point I want to make in regards of this concept, it's how Lusophone can be problematic in the sense that it mirrors and is semantically related to other powerful ideologies with devastating history, namely Lusotropicalism, which was a political ideology developed by the colonial state in the last 30 years of its existence in Africa, Portuguese colonial state. So Lusotropicalism, as we know, was a political ideology to legitimize the Portuguese control over these territories and these people. And more recently, the whole ideology of Lusophonia, which many argue, like Alfredo Margarida, a Portuguese scholar, argue that it's just Lusotropicalism with new clothes. So what I want to suggest is I prefer the term PALOP than Lusophone Africa. Now, moving forward, I want to share with you a brief a graphic description of what they call the geopolitics of Portuguese language. This is important because it's going to be clear, I hope, when we look at the ongoing language ideological debate that is taking place in Mozambique and Angola in particular. Using the insights of several scholars like Carceral, Amon, Cristóvão, Klein, and Elia, I bring together these concentric cycles of Portuguese around the world, and I started from Portugal and Brazil being the full center, and they are full center in the sense that they are recognized and codified norms of Portuguese. So, if you're going to take a course on Portuguese in the United States, more likely you're going to follow either what is called the European standard, Portuguese from Portugal, or the Brazilian standard. So these are codified norms, and then you have what I classify as semi-center, Angola and Mozambique, even though it's clear that a Angolan Portuguese or a Mozambican Portuguese, has developed it in the past few decades. These national varieties have not been codified. So there is willingness on the part of Angolans in Mozambique, the social, cultural, and political elite, to codify the national variety. But at this point, we are not quite there. That's why I classify them as semi-center. And then you have the case of Guinea-Bissau, Santo Tomé and Príncipe, and Cabo Verde, which are rudimentary center. So these are important because, when we look at the policy of language spread from Portugal and Brazil, we tend to see that resistance tends to be lesser in the rudimentary centers than in the case of Angola and Mozambique. So that is important. It's going to help us to understand why Angola and Mozambique have yet to embrace the orthographic agreement of 1990, which is what I'm going to discuss now. So there is a long history of creating a unified orthography in Portuguese. Given, Brazil and Portugal went to different paths, if you will. Since the early 20th century, you find those two states trying to come up with a solution, if you will. Obviously, these agreements were basically bilateral until 1975. These are 5 African states who are not independent. So Portugal itself was leading the conversation with Brazil. Until 1975 happens with independence, the 5 African states with Portuguese as the official language were invited to the table of negotiation. So in 1990, those 7 actors, the 5 African states, Brazil and Portugal, they signed the orthographic agreement of 1990, which basically was what I call a corpus planning for prestige planning. What do I mean by that? It was a corpus planning in the sense that the agreement went directly to the inner part of the language, modifying the spelling, for instance, by removing mute consonants. Ação in the old Portuguese spelling used to have a C that was dropped after the new agreement. This is just an example. Though the agreement was signed in 1990, it was not implemented. 1990, as we know, was a decade of multidimensional political transitions in those 5 African states. A transition from one-party state to multi-party state, as in the case of Cabo Verde, Guinea-Bissau, Mozambique, and while it was tried in Angola, it failed. It was also a transition from a planned economy to a more market economy, a transition from civil war to a peace, as in the case of Angola and Mozambique. So you had a lot of things happening in those 5 states that made the agreement, or at least made it really difficult for the implementation of the agreement. Moreover, one can make the argument that both Angola and Mozambique, they were not or they did not have high expectations of themselves. They had too much crisis on their hands, so they did not have high expectations among the of themselves. So in the 1990s, also we see some interesting developments. In 1996, a new organization was brought into existence, the Portuguese-speaking community, CPLP in Portuguese acronym. Under the aegis of the CPLP, 2 other protocols were signed in order to revamp the 1990 agreement. First, it was the prior protocol of 1998, and then the Santo Tomé protocol of 2004. I want to suggest that the second protocol from Santo Tomé it gave a new life to the agreement, but also steered a debate in Angola and Mozambique in particular. Okay, so what we have now, it's this ongoing what I call orthographic war. There is this Portuguese scholar who argues that the orthographic agreement was designed to implement what he calls Pax Orthográfica, an orthographic piece. I want to say that instead of promoting that Pax Orthográfica, it was the agreement actually led to this orthographic war. So just to move along, I realize that we don't have a lot of time. While the cases of Guinea-Bissau, Cabo Verde, and Santo Tomé, they have accepted, ratified, and in different ways implemented the new orthographic agreement. Angola and Mozambique, not so much. So we want to understand why Angola and Mozambique, they're not following suit. Why they taking time? While we hear often say that from the leaders that they are in favor of the agreement, but in reality, recently the Deutsche Welle made an interesting report where it emphasized how the debate has been forgotten the agreement has been forgotten in Angola. So I want to suggest that in case of Angola and Mozambique, they want to tie the whole agreement with the politics of national identity. So they want to emphasize the national variety of Portuguese. So they want to nationalize Portuguese, which at this point, if you will read many discourses of the leaders, the agreement does not present or does not allocate a value to the national variety. So national variety can be perceived as a symbol, as a referential symbol, if you will, of national identity. It becomes a sort of a marker, a visible, observable, objective marker of the nation. So again, this is something that can contribute to the whole project of a nation building that is still happening in Angola and Mozambique. In the case of Angola, what we can call it, the soft rejection of the orthographic agreement of 1990 tends to be more consistent and stronger. The Angolan Minister of Foreign Affairs, the Oliveira, he's no longer the minister. At one point mentioned that yes, Angola was in favor of ratifying the agreement, but the whole strategy of Angola can be summarized in the expression that he put forth: ratificar para ratificar, meaning that the agreement needs to include some of the linguistic elements of Angola before Angola can actually adopt it. So at this point, they argue that it does not fully captures Angolaness, and it needs to be ratified. It needs to be corrected to include some of the graphic representation of Angolan languages. Just to give you a brief example, in typical, traditionally in Angolan national languages. Thank you. In Angolan national languages, there is a wide use of words like K, W, which typically are not common in Portuguese. So they're going with this debate. I also want to suggest that there is ongoing diplomatic alliance between Angola and Mozambique. We read from speeches and discourses made by Angolan officials, we get the sense that there is a ongoing conversation happening between those two state officials. For instance, a few years ago, back in early 2010s, the Minister of Education from Angola, emphasized how he had a conversation with counterparts from Mozambique and how their views were similar. So there is a lot of conversation happening between those two states. And I want to suggest that perhaps the Luanda-Maputo axis maybe can be a reaction to Lisbon-Brasilia axis. As I mentioned before, the orthographic agreement of 1990 was basically an agreement that focused on unifying those two norms, the European Portuguese and Brazilian Portuguese, and it did not have a lot of input from Africa. So one can make the argument that those two states, the big palop, as I call them, Angola and Mozambique, they want to include their own socio-linguistic reality in this new debate. Lastly, I also want to suggest that the fact that Angola and Mozambique are taking longer to ratify the agreement can be perceived as a reaction against Lusophonia. Again, as I mentioned before, Lusophonia can be understood as this political ideology that links all of the states to Portugal and emphasize what is often referred to as common history, common language, and common culture, which in reality may not be what's happening. So by rejecting the agreement as it is presented now, and by including elements of Bantu languages from Angola, from Mozambique, can be understood as a reaction against Lusophonia, this powerful ideology, as I mentioned. Along these lines, I also want to be clear that in those two states, particularly Angola and Mozambique, there is a high willingness to craft and develop a national variety of Portuguese. We read from political elites and from cultural elites, we find the sense that they all agree that there is actually a Mozambican or an Angolan Portuguese. In Angola, for instance, many are talking about how there is a need to craft what it's called Angolano or Angolan Portuguese. So all of these together help us understand why the orthographic agreement has stalled in those two states. It's not that they don't agree with it, but they want to be clear that their own national identity is represented in that agreement. I had other points to make, and just very briefly, if I may, just 30 seconds. 30 seconds. Yes. So the other. I had this very ambitious plan, I guess. But the other point is how Portuguese, in fact, it's a language that is increasingly pushed out in African international relations. I had some points to make in regards of ECOWAS. If I may just show you this picture that I took from the ECOWAS Parliament, I think it represents what is the situation of African states with Portuguese as the official language within the context of African regional organizations. Probably you're not going to notice, but the fact that the Cabo Verdean flag is upside down tells us a lot about the role. This is an official picture from the ECOWAS Parliament, and yet the Cabo Verdean flag is upside down. It tells a lot about the weight of these states. So perhaps in the Q&A section, we can have more discussion about this. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Abel. You've been so persuasive that I hereby rename this panel PALOP and not Lusophone. Okay. All right. Next, we have our own Anna Mester, who is an associate professor here at UMass Boston in the Department of Latin American and Iberian Studies. And the name of her paper is The Concentration Camp of Tarrafal, Carceral Islands, and Archipelagos in, shall we call it PALOP, Africa, not Lusophone?
Please, I wholeheartedly agree, PALOP. Thank you to the organizers, the moderator, and the participants. This has been a wonderful day and a half of conversations, and I look forward to more. And thank you for the undue promotion. I'm an assistant professor in the
I'm so sorry about that. Thank you.
Thank you. So the presentation I proposed in the title is a little bit more than I could cover in 20 minutes, but I would like to focus on 3 key historical moments of this penitentiary and then make some broader connections in PALOP as well. So now I will share my screen because I have some images to share with you all. Unfortunately, I'm not seeing it show up. Is everybody able to see?
Yes, we can.
Thank you. All right, so the penal colony of Tarrafal is perhaps the most infamous symbol of Salazar's carceral violence throughout the Portuguese-speaking world. In historiography, it is commonly understood in terms of its two distinct phases of operation. First, phase one from 1936 to 1954, and phase two from 1961 to 1974. In the first phase of operation, the Salazar regime deported and incarcerated communists, anarchists, and anti-fascists from Portugal to the penal colony found just outside of the village of Tarrafal on the northern tip of Santiago Island in the Cabo Verdean archipelago. In 1961, the camp reopened to confine the anti-colonial intellectuals from Angola, Cabo Verde, and Guinea-Bissau. Today, the camp has been converted into the Museo da Resistência, a space for remembrance of the atrocities committed by the Salazar regime. However, within this chronology of the prison camp, there's a lesser understood third phase, which offers a rich complication to scholarship on the process of Cabo Verdean independence, its immediate aftermath, and the role of incarceration in nation building and the consolidation of state power. Indeed, in 1930, the establishment of the penitentiary in Tarrafal was crucial to the consolidation of the Salazar's new state. The camp was not merely a space upon which Salazarism exerted its power. Rather, Tarrafal, and by extension, the colonial territories in Africa, were fundamental in defining power, discipline, and the self-conception of the Salazar's new state. As the regime planned for the construction of Tarrafal, building a penal colony on African territories posed a set of legal and discursive dilemmas that impacted how the new state perceived and defined its own power. Commonly considered the year of the new state, 1933 brought many structural changes to the Portuguese government. With the leadership of Prime Minister Antonio de Oliveira Salazar, state repression and revitalization of imperialist ideologies became the main pillars of the new state. The year 1933 also marked the first studies commissioned to begin the implementation of the penal colonies in the overseas territories. The decree law 23,203, signed on November 6, 1933, was key in defining the nature of political crimes, while establishing imprisonment and deportation to the overseas penal colony as a punishment for suspected dissenters. This became a turning point for the already authoritarian Salazar regime. Portuguese anarchist Manuel Firmo, who fought alongside the Republicans in the Spanish Civil War before being deported to Tarrafal, observed that, quote, an abyss separates the political prisoner from the prisoner of common crime. However, the fascist dictatorship made a tabula rasa of this dissimilarity, end quote. Unlike prisoners of common crime, political prisoners were not incarcerated on the basis of a crime, but rather on perceived threat to state integrity and ideology. Characterized as delinquents or degenerates, political prisoners were elements of society that inherently proved dangerous to the establishment, therefore needing to be removed or expelled. Criminality was no longer an act or a transgression of the law. It became an inherent characteristic or immutable identitarian mark among certain segments of society. This dynamic is reminiscent of the invisible enemy in the Cuban War of Independence context of reconcentraciones, commonly cited as one of the first instances of concentration camps where an entire social body was suspected, thus criminalized, and came under constant vigilance on the basis of criminal potential. Through the use of the term degenerates and retrogrades, the new state deployed a racialized language in order to identify, authorize, and exclude internal enemies of the state. These are some of the first legislative expressions in the new state of what Alexander Wahelia calls racializing assemblages, a set of political relations that deploy language, institutions, discourses, and infrastructures to discipline humanity into categories of, quote, full humans, not quite humans, and non-humans, end quote. And specifically in the modern West, this barring is performed on, quote, non-white subjects. Wahelia demonstrates that at the heart of the modern state is a hierarchical social discipline based on race and white supremacy. And Amy Césaire's concept of the boomerang effect helps us understand that these are instances in which colonialist procedures were applied also to Europeans, quote, which until then had been reserved exclusively for the Arabs of Algeria, the Kurds of India, and the Blacks of Africa, end quote. Césaire shows fascist violence not as an aberration of European historical progress, but as a phenomenon integral to modern history.
Anna, can I just interrupt real quick? I'm sorry, your slideshow isn't playing, so we can see the slides, but we don't see them advancing. Would you be able to
I only have a few, and so then the next slide will be coming up in just a second.
Okay.
Thank you, though. After the Portuguese secret police was created in 1933 to consolidate the powers of state violence, repression, and vigilance into one governmental body, there was a sharp increase in criminalization of suspected ideological dissenters, resulting in overcrowding of prisons in Portugal. As a result, the construction of a large penal colony in Cape Verde became an urgent priority. And here is the first slide. Is everybody able to see that slide?
Can you put it on presentation mode?
It blocks the view of my paper if I do.
I see. Oh, that's fine.
Sorry.
Yeah.
After considering several sites, a commission decided upon Tarrafal on the island of Santiago in Cape Verde, headed by the modernist architect José Angélico Tinelli Telmo, the father of the Portuguese Suave style. The commission sent a study to the colony in Cape Verde in 1935 to the Interior Ministry. The study lamented the lack of legislative support for the project, as the carceral question in the colonies had not been written into law. While the Cotinelli study was eschewed in favor of a more modest plan, its lasting contribution was the decree law number 26,539 of 1936, which brought into legislation the penal colony of Tarrafal for political prisoners that specifically, quote, are refractory to the discipline of this establishment or harmful to other prisoners, end quote. Elements of society and enemies that were resistant to reform and likely to contaminate society were to be symbolically and physically banished to the colonial metropole. A team sent to the island of Santiago in the 1930s completed a study in order to construct the penal colony in the municipality of Tarrafal and returned to Portugal with the following set of photographs. The first image of an arid flatland represented Achada Grande as a tabula rasa marked up by hand to designate the future locations of the penitentiary, barracks, headquarters, and the cemetery. The land is taken to be a blank slate, which could be written, built, and conceptualized. The second image, taken from the same position, shows buildings of the provisional camp in place. The changing landscape is labeled accordingly, with the exception of the Frigideira, which I have marked for everyone, translated as the frying pan. And it is a 6 by 3 meter cement building without windows where prisoners were held in solitary confinement, with temperatures often reaching 40 to 60 degrees Celsius. With the construction of 8 pavilions in the penal colony, the space was partitioned and fragmented in order to keep inmates from congregating in masses. In Santiago Island, the construction had profound implications and reverberations as the delineations and fragmentations of space are synonymous with power. Achille Mbembe, remembering the words of Frantz Fanon in Necropolitics, writes that the discipline and vigilance of space through parceling is a mechanism of colonial violence. Quote, colonial occupation entails first and foremost the division of space into compartments. It involves the setting of boundaries and internal frontiers epitomized by barracks and police stations. End quote. The construction of Tarrafal in the 20th century was the latest palimpsestic layer of the geographies of terror. The island of Santiago was first colonized as a trading post to traffic enslaved persons to the Americas. The military fortress in Ribeira Grande, known as Cidade Velha today, marked the imperial landscape since the 15th century. While spatially, prisons are constructed at the edges of society, hidden from view, their construction and operation are central to the disciplinary violence reverberating beyond the bounds of their walls. Paradoxically, as prison walls are meant to confine and separate, the walls are porous boundaries, and penitentiaries serve as metaphors for the pervasive disciplinary tactics fragmenting society along racial and gendered lines by authoritarian and colonial governments. Moreover, Tarrafal was just one in a constellation of approximately, and this is a conservative estimate, of 45 prison camps established across the Portuguese territories spanning Africa and Asia. After a 7-year hiatus, the penal colony reopened in 1961 under the name Campo de Trabalho de Chambon, and as anti-colonial uprisings swept the African continent and an armed struggle waged in Angola, Guinea-Bissau, Mozambique. The Campo de Trabalho de Chambon received African national liberation fighters who were deemed dangerous, quote, terrorists, intent on undermining Portuguese colonization efforts. Among the imprisoned were anti-colonial intellectuals and writers from across Lusophone Africa, or the PALOP countries, namely Antonio Cardoso, Antonio Jacinto, José Luandino Vieira, and Nwanyanga Shitu. These authors denounced the oppression, violence, and discrimination and dismal conditions of life under colonialism. Their literary oeuvres grouped under the label combat literature, for they sparked resistance and national consciousness during the liberation wars. It is worth noting that the conceptualizations of anti-colonialism and autonomous nation states also emerged from within the prison cell. I would like to conclude with some inconclusive thoughts and questions about a third and less understood phase of the Tarrafal prison camp. The concentration camp of Tarrafal closed on May 1st, 1974. And here's a photograph. This is a photograph of the second phase, and here's the photograph of the day of liberation of the prison camp. On May 1st, 1974, when all political prisoners were liberated. Nevertheless, by December of the same year, the camp was reopened to incarcerate 70 Cabo Verdean nationals, critical of the PAIGC's handling of the independence transition process. The majority belonged to the Union of People of Cabo Verde and the Democratic Union of Cabo Verde, and their confinement assured, quote, neutralization of individuals who risked tranquility and peace of the archipelago, end quote. The reopening lasted less than a year, and the camp closed definitively on July 19th, 1975. This turn of events is not unique to Tarrafal. Anti-colonial movements turned newly independent governments relied on incarceration of political dissidents and members of society which they deemed threatened the integrity of the state or the revolutionary project's realization of eradication of colonial and imperial vestiges. This is the case in Mozambique with re-education camps, the prison on Karash Island in Guinea-Bissau, and the pervasive police and carceral violence still affecting Angola today. Instead of viewing these episodes as an aberration in revolutionary history, the role of carceral violence poses conceptual challenges to the understanding of the moment of decolonization as an end of historical period or a paradigm rupture. Pedro Martins, who's also pictured in this photo, a Cabo Verdean clandestine liberation fighter and the youngest person imprisoned at Tarrafal, is a critic of the process of decolonization and views it as a process of negotiation and compromise, which lacked, quote, political openness. Fanon argues that this, quote, notion of compromise is very important in the case of a decolonization, end quote, because of the way in which elites did not manage to break ties with colonialism. And here I would like to end with an open-ended question, putting these histories in conversation with the work of anthropologist David Scott and his conceptual framework of anti-colonial history as written in the genre of tragedy. Scott argues that anti-colonialist historical narratives create a reference, and albeit a negative one, of the colonial past. The anti-colonial narrative posits, quote, the relationship between past and the hope for future, one imploded as a narrative of revolutionary overcoming, end quote. As suggested by Scott's conceptual work, in the attempts at severing and eradicating with colonial past, enforcing its state legitimacy through carceral, punitive, and disciplinary measures are reminiscent of colonialist violence. The notion of colonial continuities beyond the end of official colonialism opens the possibility of re-examining ways in which colonial epistemologies live on into the post-colonial period. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Anna. Thank you. That was really nicely on time. Thank you so much. All right. Next, we have Aminah Pilgrim, who is a senior lecturer in one of our departments here at UMass Boston, the Department of Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies. The name of her paper is Fighting for Gender Justice from Pre-Independence to Poderoza. Thank you, Aminah. Go ahead.
Thank you, Kiki, and thank you to my co-panelists. I will begin by simply giving you a disclaimer. This paper is not a traditional paper. It's more of a presentation of a project that is ongoing. It's a glimpse of a larger work that is going to soon be published in an anthology entitled Cabo Verdean Women Writing Remembrance, Resistance and Revolution, based on the Poderoza conference. And so today I'm going to share with you some of the work that my co-founder and I have done in the Poderoza conference, as well as some reflections in general on Cabo Verdean women's studies. And with your permission, I will share my slides.
I think you can go ahead and share.
Okay.
You have permission.
So thank you again for this opportunity. I thank all of the organizers, particularly Kiki and Gifty, for inviting me to take part in this wonderful event. So first, the significance of Cabo Verdean women's studies to understanding the themes of this conference. And I chose to present this in light of the fact that March is Women's History Month, at least in the US. And in light of this work that I've been engaged in for over a decade. So just a few quotes to kind of contextualize this work. The first one highlights the danger of the lack of stories about women in the history of humankind, which, as it says there, leave a gaping hole in our hearts and in our spirit. And I want to also highlight one of my inspirations, which is the Haitian diaspora historian, Michel Trouillot, who writes about silencing the past. And I'm sure that many of you are familiar with that work. So it seems that there exists, significant silences within the body of studies about Cabo Verde on Cabo Verdean women, and it's being filled slowly but surely. But there is still a lot of work to be done. Also, I include here a quote by Thomas Sankara. The woman leads a twofold existence, indeed. The depth of her social ostracism being equaled only by her stoic endurance, to live in harmony with the society of man, to conform with men's demands. She resigns herself to a self-effacement that is demeaning. She sacrifices herself. And what I would say in regards to this quote is that, as you will see reflected in some of the stories that I'm going to highlight, the case of Cabo Verdean women does not always reflect that kind of tragic twofold existence. Indeed, Cabo Verdean women have found empowerment, agency, and ways to overcome what Criollos at once called suffering in silence. And so hopefully you will agree that these stories are encouraging and represent some different paradigms through which we can look at the history of women of African descent and African women in Cabo Verde. Lastly, the final quote from social media figure who calls herself Lioness. When you disrupt the existing conditions and refuse to accept anything less than what you know you are worth, you start making those who oppress you so uncomfortable that they will try anything to discredit you. And I'll return to that quote in the presentation. So just a few themes and concepts that I would ask everyone to keep in mind as I'm presenting. The idea of African feminisms, and I'm thinking about Aminah Mama here, one of the most iconic African feminists, who asks us to think about African feminisms in the plural, and highlights the importance of feminist frameworks. And like Aminah Mama, I also find as a thinker, as an organizer, as a scholar activist, that the application of feminism to the analysis of the histories that I study is critical, not only to bring to light stories of women's oppression, but to, as we say in Poderoza, rebrand Criola's experiences and restore the agency of Cape Verdean women, women of African descent. And so this is one of the keys to the project of Cape Verdean Women Studies. And this project is a part of, in fact, knowledge production and the creation of this field, this new and growing field of Cape Verdean Women Studies. So I would also, again, highlight agency, obviously patriarchy, the value of these women's words and stories, the idea of empowered motherhood, interdependence, the grandmother effect and intergenerational bonds, legacy, identity, and identity formation, among other themes. Very briefly, you can read along the slide, Cape Verdean women in colonial times, and I'm talking about, the more than 200 years before independence of Cape Verde in 1975, represented these particular tropes. First, I would highlight the experience of widows who had a certain level of independence that was more than married women may have experienced in spite of their social class. They represented children and also their own family's property rights. And this is a kind of a very simplistic review of this history for the sake of time. But my point here is just to ask us to think about the opportunity that exists to challenge the canon of work on Cape Verde with the inclusion of Cape Verdean women and other gendered experiences. Next, I would ask you to think about what happened to women when they remarried. And marriage here is viewed as a strategy by some scholars, a strategy to retain local political and economic rights. Third, the fight for land rights in colonial times highlights the experiences of women, and in particular, scholars such as my colleague Terza Silva Lima Neves have highlighted the revolt Ribeira Manuel in Santiago of 1910. And there's so much more that can be said about that if I have time. Also, in terms of the diaspora, my own studies focus on the US-based Cape Verdean diaspora. And in the US, I would highlight that in the first two waves of immigration, there were mostly males, leaving behind a majority women and youth population in places specifically such as Fogo and Brava. However, when later on girls and women migrants settled and began to make up larger numbers of the population, and they also made up significant numbers of the educated and professional class of migrants. Excuse the typo there. This image is it's a very well-known image to folks who have studied Cape Verdean migration to the US. It's an image from the New Bedford Whaling Museum collection. And I just included there to provide a visual of a later wave of immigrants that included more women and young girls. And I want to also highlight that this project is very much a transdisciplinary project. Myself, trained as a historian, and my primary method is oral history. So I've had the blessing of being able to conduct oral histories with women in Cape Verde and in the US. And so much of my work is informed by those interviews. And the project that I mentioned, which Terza and I co-lead, is also heavily based on oral histories. Oral history has proven to be one of the most important methods for this work, since the voices of women have been silenced. It's a way to recover their voices. It's a way for them to, or for us, I should say, to tell our stories in our own voices. And it's a source of knowledge production, which challenges the patriarchal archives. I will not go in detail about each of these oral histories, but I just include a few quotes here. This is one quote by Eugenia Forts, who became a significant activist within the US Cape Verdean diaspora of the first half of the, well, I shouldn't say that, 20th century, roughly the 1950s through, I would say, the 90s, and was more so active as a civil rights activist, not specifically someone who was fighting for gender justice, but did embody gender justice in the work that she did, and may not have labeled herself a feminist, but certainly inspired a generation of Criollas, including myself, to engage in the activism that we have done. Another quote that you can read for yourself. What I would highlight about Maria Anika is that she's one of the rare return migrants that I was able to interview. She came to the US, as you can see here, for medical treatment. And then she went back. And so she shared with me in her oral history that she actually felt in some ways more liberated back home in Cape Verde because of her not being able to move, as the quote says, the fact that she was illiterate in English and had various barriers. She obviously had, barriers in her home in Fogo, but the oral history is significant because it problematizes, I think, the idea of gender equity, and it forces us to ask different questions than we might normally ask. I'll skip to Paula Forte. Her memoir was published posthumously. Paula Forte is just one of the many women who have contributed to Cape Verdean independence. And on both sides or on all sides of the Atlantic, whether it's in the US diaspora, the European diaspora, the African continental population, as well as in Cape Verde, women were central to the fight for independence. And if they were not on the front lines, as Paula was, who was a nurse and a government worker and politician, then they were doing things like fundraising, as in the case of Eugenia Forts, who I mentioned earlier, who in the 70s was part of a population of Cape Verdean Americans, activists, men and women who were raising money and conducting local organizing around supporting the fight for independence on the archipelago. Here I want to highlight the fact that as co-founders of Poderoza, both Terza and I are simultaneously engaging in scholar activism and engaging in the work of, trying to tell the stories of those that came before us. So in this slide here, Terza asked us to pay attention to some of the other roles that women held within the fight for independence. I already mentioned Paula Forts. You have here some of the other key names in the struggle and their roles as teachers, nurses, and also those that fought alongside the men. There's also a list of the key organizations representing the fight for gender justice. The oldest, Organização das Mulheres de Cabo Verde, the Associação das Mulheres, Professional Women's Association. There are several organizations that I will also talk about, which have been formed in the diaspora. And these are still active. Most recently, there has been much attention paid to the successes gained in the fight for parity in Cabo Verde, and also the fight to protect young girls and women victims of sexual violence. And so the organizations that you see here, the RMPCV and the OMCV organizations have been at the forefront of those fights, as well as ICIEG, the Institute or the Center for Gender Equity. And significant to note, Cabo Verde has one of the highest political representations of women in government in the African region and in the world. And in spite of that, and in spite of this rich history, there is a post-independence loss of memory or amnesia about women's contributions to the Cape Verdean state. There's also a lack of preservation of this history, and several colleagues, including Celeste Forts and Terza and myself, are working to address that. I would talk a little bit, I know I'm running out of time, about the idea of the 11th island. And
3 minutes.
Okay, no problem. Here I would just highlight the fact that one of the ways to understand transnationalism is to look at the involvement of Cape Verdean women as organizers and look at the strategic actions on the part of these women in terms of social, economic remittances, and I would add also education and politics as well. So this is my last slide. I'll just ask you to read the slide along for yourselves. One of the efforts of Poderoza, which has been influenced by not only African feminisms, but African American womenism, has been to use the idea of say their names or say our names, and to literally curate a list of names to recognize the women who have fought for gender justice and who have fought to reclaim our identities as criollas through telling our own stories. So this slide includes just a small selection of names. The project of Poderoza, which you can look up on your own time. I won't take up time to show you the link, but the project of Poderoza began as a biannual conference. Abel Amado actually was one of our featured honored guests and spoke at one of our installments. So it features Cape Verdean women and allies or accomplices, and it has attempted to lift up and honor the work that has been done and address the silences that exist. So I guess since I'm out of time, I will just end with, again, acknowledging that this is an ongoing project. This is a work of both scholarly activism as well as literal activism to fight for gender justice, not only in academia, but in the diaspora as a whole. And this fight is a dynamic one. It's a personal as well as a professional one. And I'm just really grateful to be here amongst you today, and hopefully we'll have time to discuss a little bit more during the Q&A. Thank you, Kiki.
Thank you so much, Aminah. Fantastic presentations, really interesting stories. We'll get into it during the Q&A. Our final speaker is José Cossa, and he is an associate professor at Pennsylvania State University, University Park, and the name of his presentation is A Profile of Eduardo Chivambo. I've never been able to pronounce Mondlane. Demystification or mere reflection on his interactions in the United States of America. Go ahead, Jose.
Muito boa tarde. Good afternoon. Thank you very much, Kiki, and surely gifted. And Aminah, thank you for reminding us to be grateful for all the people that have done great work on, ahead of us, and we're just simply following their footsteps. I want to thank my other fellow panelists, Anna and Abel, for educating us and provoking us further to problematize these issues. So I moved to Syracuse a while ago, I think 2006. And when I moved here, I realized that there was very little known about Eduardo Mondlane. And yet it is one of the institutions that was very instrumental in his career and his being. And Kiki, it is Mondlane. I know, it's right. So I'm originally from Mozambique. And so once I was here, I ended up doing some research on Eduardo Mondlane. And then I also wrote a chapter on Eduardo Mondlane, but then also realized that it's important for the community of Syracuse to know about him. So I wrote an article for the newspaper, local newspaper. And that was pretty interesting because it also connected me to other people who knew Mondlane. So in my article, in the Post-Standard, that was published on February 3 of 2012 to commemorate Eduardo Mondlane's assassination and to bring a wide awareness of his connection to Syracuse, I shared my hope that the long-standing connection between the Syracuse community and the people of Mozambique be brought to the attention of a generation largely unaware of such an important connection. So Mondlane served as an assistant professor of anthropology at Syracuse University in 1961 to 1963. He is to Mozambicans what Dr. King Jr. is to Americans in the United States. While there may not be an exact parallelism in their life trajectory and overall strategies in fighting against injustice, with King resorting to non-armed struggle against the then oppressive regime in the United States, and Mondlane to an armed struggle against the then oppressive Portuguese colonial regime in Mozambique. Both understood that injustice against Black people in Mozambique and the United States, respectively, was injustice against all people. Thus, each of them is seen as a symbol of courage and justice. Eduardo Mondlane was born in 1920 and raised in Mojahani district in Manjacaz, which is a province in the province of Gaza, which is the second province if you're counting from the southern part of Mozambique. There's Maputo and Gaza. And through the help of Swiss missionaries, Presbyterian missionaries to be specific, and working under harsh circumstances, and his mother's encouragement and support, he attended schooling in Mozambique, in South Africa, Portugal, and the United States. And his multi-country education afforded him firsthand experience with the injustice perpetrated by the regimes that existed both in South Africa and Mozambique against Black people. So on the other hand, this experience, along with these interactions with politically conscious individuals in the aforementioned countries, contributed to Mondlane's embarking on a quest to liberate Mozambique from Portuguese colonialism through the founding of Mozambique's Liberation Front, also known as Frelimo, in 1962, and then the beginning of the liberation struggle in 1964. So as a result of Mondlane's and Frelimo's efforts, Mozambique was able to declare its independence, or her independence, from Portugal on June 25 of 1975. At the time, I was 3 years old, so that kind of ages me a little. One of the dominant aspects of Mondlane's memory is the revolutionary aspect that often ends up being part of a myth, and I want to underline the myth created and sustained over many years, especially after the death of the individual about whom the myth was created. But Mondlane's story is not characterized by a straightforward path to grandeur and heroism, which is what we often see, right? Eduardo Mondlane is often invoked as a quasi-divine figure whose memory serves to remind the people of the sacrifice that one man made for the country of Mozambique. So obscures the current reality of the people. It is also important to emphasize here the distinction, and it says that my internet is kind of flawed or unstable, so I hope it's not stopping the presentation. But I want to emphasize the distinction between remembering Mondlane as a political, mythological figure, which is a hero of undeniable courage and integrity, and remember Mondlane as an ordinary man with enormous analytical capabilities of the capacities of understanding the effects of colonialism, whose role in the struggle against Portuguese colonialism depended largely on the encouragement of other human beings. In other words, Mondlane was not born a hero, nor did he become a hero or a champion of justice on his own. So in the United States, Mondlane contributed his thoughts at Oberlin College as an undergraduate student in sociology, at Northwestern University as an MA and PhD student in urban sociology, and at Syracuse University as a lecturer on the anthropology faculty, an active contributor to the Eastern African Studies program established by Marshall Segal. And so Melville Herskovits at Northwestern was the person behind Mondlane's coming to Northwestern University and became very important for the beginning of his political career. In a letter to Herskovits on December 12, 1952, for instance, Mondlane expressed interest in pursuing his master's degree at Northwestern and because he had a financial hurdle, he turned to Herskovits to write a letter of recommendation to the University Administration Sociology Department. So by this time, Mondlane's reputation as a speaker on Africa's problems was already making itself felt. However, it was in this letter that Mondlane made a profound confession of his political awakening about the problems of the African continent, a confession that shows deep introspection and reflection on his origins as an African his present and his future in relation to the problems of the African continent. Mondlane saw sociology and Northwestern in particular as having a combination of sociology and anthropology, and the existence of the Institute for African Studies as a locus of learning potential that would help him in this dilemma. And so he made this confession, and I quote, "This semester, I have been dividing my time between studying and lecturing all over this state," meaning Ohio. Many organizations are becoming more and more interested in the problems of Africa. I'm trying very hard to be as objective as possible, and I underline objective. The more I talk about Africa, the more I feel the need to study the problems involved. For although I am fresh from Africa, as I would like to believe, there are many things I am still unclear about. End of quote. Within that same confession, Mondlane showed the determination to enter the program at Northwestern University without abandoning the possibility of returning home to Mozambique to work for a few years in case he was not admitted. So there was no doubt in his mind that for him, the solution lay in the direct study of sociology, and more specifically with a focus on social change and rural and urban problems. Within this context of exchange with Herskovits, I should point out that Marshall Segal's comment that Mondlane never gave him the impression of being a revolutionary corroborates his confession. So Mondlane himself had never made a claim at that point of being a revolutionary, and Segal had witnessed that in him. So Mondlane's focus seemed more academic than political, but it was via exposure to African affairs during classes and discussions, in lectures and related activities, that a concrete interest in the liberation of the African continent emerged. So Herskovits seemed very instrumental in this process of transition to politics, according to his description in the reference letter he wrote in support of when Mondlane was applying for master's program at Northwestern University. So Herskovits described him as someone, Mondlane, as someone who honored this invitation to discuss the problems of Portuguese East Africa in his seminar on contemporary Africa, which had as its audience advanced graduate students and a group of faculty members discussing contemporary problems on the continent. So Segal said to me that he met Mondlane at Northwestern University as a classmate, and in turn, Segal became instrumental in getting Mondlane to come to Syracuse University to hold a professorship. And Segal was at the time the director of East African Studies at Syracuse University, and so he was in a good position to bring his former colleague on board. So they were colleagues at Northwestern University in the late 1950s during graduate studies, and he says he spent time with him in Dar es Salaam shortly before his assassination, Mondlane's assassination. And according to Segal, Syracuse University, and I want to underline this, Syracuse University was the only university in the United States to give leave of absence to a faculty member to lead a revolution. These are Segal's words. So Segal characterizes Mondlane as being charming, kind, intelligent, warm, sincere, and friendly. And later on, another testimony of Mondlane's personality and influence comes from Maribel Maisel, who said in a correspondence with Du Bois, I would like, and I started quote, I would like to tell you about my friend. You may have heard of him. He was the first person to come to the United States from Mozambique. He was a student at a white university in Johannesburg until Dr. Malan forced him out of the country. Then he went for a year to the University of Lisbon and spent the summer at the Sorbonne in Paris. He came to this country, United States, in the summer of 1951 and went to Oberlin for 2 years. And since last year, and at present, he is at Northwestern University working on his doctorate in social psychology. Now, he has given hundreds of lectures in this country since coming here and has served as a consultant to the Christian Council He is the author of Chitango, Filho do Chefe, which has been translated into 5 languages. Eduardo Mondlane personally speaks 7. I know that if you are ever in the neighborhood of Chicago, he would love to talk to you. End of quote. Now, there's little details about Mondlane that get confused here and there, like what kind of degree he was doing. So this is one of the evidences, because Maribel says he was doing social psychology. So Mondlane's role as a revolutionary then begins to unfold clearly after his graduation. And I'm just fast forwarding here. So in a letter he wrote to Herskovits on September 9, 1957, after completing his doctoral studies and accepting a job with the United Nations Trusteeship Division, Mondlane informed Herskovits of the departure to Chicago of his very good friend, as he described this person, whose name was Joseph Biroli Baranyanka, who, according to Mondlane, was the son of an important and paramount chief of a region in Rwanda, Urundi. And this, for those who are interested in Rwandan history, this is actually a very important figure there, because there was, a connection with genocides and so forth and so forth. It's a very controversial figure, but at the time, Mondlane met this man here, and they were friends. And little do we know what happens in the future. So you take advantage of the moments and you connect as best as you can. So the letter was accompanied by a document entitled "A Study Group of Congo-African Problems: An Introduction to the Principles of the Problem." Of the principles and programs of the organization, which describe the political agenda of the Alfred Marzorati Study Group, named after former Belgian administrator in Africa at the time. In the document, the group expressed interest in a process of smooth and passive transition and freedom for Africans and the creation of a new political relationship via constructive programs. This is an alternative to what the group referred to as the desire of the African peoples to take their destinies into their own hands. Interesting encounter, and again, it would be good to study more about Biroli and his influence in Rwanda, but also to demonstrate that Mondlane was still trying to figure his way out about his position on the African problem. In January of 1968, the then Eduardo Mondlane appeared as one of the invited speakers at a symposium to examine violence organized and funded by students at Northwestern University. So violence was the theme of the symposium. Speakers included Charles Hamilton, Stanley Milgram, professor of psychology at the City College of New York, Ernest Chambers, a barber and spokesman for the Black militancy in Omaha, Nebraska, Stratton Lane, who was a professor at Illinois State Teachers College. Vincent Harding was the chair of the history department at Spelman College. James Lawson, whom we all know, was then the vice president of the Fellowship of Reconciliation, a religious pacifist organization, and former advisor to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and Robert Theobald, author. Leslie Fielder was author, critic, educator, and Bosley Calther, former New York Times staff writer. So it is likely that Mondlane attended some of these symposia in 1964 and 65. The theme was rebellion, another symposium, rebellion, another was diminishing man, and the other was the new urgency. And that such would have influenced him. So Mondlane's session was on the topic of violence as outlet in the previous one on violence, was violence as outlet. And he argued as president of Frelimo at that time that the use of violence in a revolution is accepted only when it is imperative. It would be incomplete to end this talk without addressing the fact that Mondlane also influenced the community at Northwestern University, Robert Lee, and Syracuse University, and the Christian community with which he related. On the subject of violence, it was interesting to talk to Chris Berg, because Chris Berg made a reference to, here at Syracuse University, that in Mondlane's farewell, Chris said, "Oh, I heard that you were getting weapons from the Chinese." And Mondlane, in response, said to him, "We'll get weapons from wherever we can." So, influencing the community that we interact, these are my last remarks, that we shall interact with is not necessarily extraordinary, but it is inevitable. What highlights the nature of Mondlane's influence to the communities he interacted with is the complexity with which he navigated his roles as a family man, a Christian, intellectual, politician, and a revolutionary. Comparing him to Martin Luther King Jr., the Reverend Crane lamented the fact that Mondlane's magnitude was not captured and argued that the fact that he chose violence does not diminish his stature as a Christian or a protagonist of freedom. He felt deep solidarity with all members of the human race, a fact that did not allow him to dissociate himself from common guilt and collective bad conscience. End of quote. Wendell Bell, who was Mondlane's professor at Northwestern University, acknowledges that Mondlane had an enormous influence on his interest and faith in the cause of the Caribbean. Bell admits that in retrospect, Mondlane prepared him to be receptive to the possibility of political freedom in Jamaica and testifies to the fact that Mondlane worked tirelessly to mobilize support in the United States for his country's liberation from Portuguese rule. And this, ladies and gentlemen, and everyone in the room, is the end of my presentation of profile of Eduardo Mondlane. Thank you.
Just on time. Thank you so much, Jose. And I learned so much, even though I pride myself as a seasoned Africanist who has studied, all of these issues and personalities that you are showcasing. But I had always pronounced Eduardo's name as Mondlane. So now I know it's Mondlane. Thank you. Thank you all. Wow, what a fascinating panel. We have lots of time for questions. And so now I have to be a good moderator and figure out this chat thing. See where the questions are. I can't even find chat. Okay. Do you guys want to ask each other questions while I look for the chat questions from the audience? I know there were quite a few, and I know that
I actually have one question for Anna Mester, if I may. And fantastic topic, and I like your presentation. So, but one thing that always triggers me, perhaps it's because of my obsession with concepts, as you noticed before. But it's the old concept of campo de concentração in Cabo Verdean historiography. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit, to what extent was it really a campo de concentração? Was it really a concentration camp, or that name was employed for political reasons?
Thank you, Abel.
Thank you. That's a very rich question. And I might not be able to settle the debate for you because I think the name in itself has a very political charge to it. But from what I saw within documents is that the first phase of prisoners who were sent from Portugal, who were anti-fascists from Portugal, they, after the democratic opening in 1974, had a lot of movement around organizing and remembering, and the slogan "Tarrafal nunca mais," never again. And they were really pushed this idea of calling it a concentration camp and linking it to calling Salazarism fascist, which in some circles you can see that as perhaps controversial and in others not. It's interesting to note that some of the architects involved in studies for the camp traveled abroad, including to Nazi Germany, to study the concentration camps. And so that perhaps may be a proof to there being some legitimacy to it. Others argue that perhaps because the numbers did not reach the same levels that you see, for example, during the Nazi period, that it's incomparable. But then again, we have to enter into the notions of looking at where concentration camps come from, what are the definitions of a concentration camp. And in my work a little bit, I do talk about sort of other instances in Cuba and South Africa where we see the force of concentrating people and this idea of the invisible enemy coming at play. And so I think to sum it up a little bit, I think it's a little bit of a both. It's on the one hand, hoping that it gives legitimacy to this history that is not remembered in the West or within Africa at large. On the other hand, it's also a question of political motives as well.
Thank you. Now I do have some chat questions. One comes from Falu Ngom, our colleague, and he has 3 questions. So, and they're for all panelists, anyone who wants to take them. So the first question is, what is the effect of social media on the corpus planning that you have discussed? And Falu, if you're there you are. Please tell me who you're directing this particular question to, because you did say you.
This is for my good friend Abel.
Abel, okay. Okay, you've got one question, Abel. Falu has another question, and we're giving him, we're conceding to him with all these questions because he's an organizer, okay? He's on the steering committee. Given the involvement of China and the rise of English, are Chinese and English being commodified in former Portuguese-speaking Africa? I'm assuming that's for Abel as well.
That's right.
And the last one is, are Ajami literates in northern Mozambique who have been writing their languages using the Arabic script as considered literate or not officially? And is that for José Cossa?
For Rose and Abel.
And Annabelle. Okay, so we'll give both of you about 5 minutes to throw out some responses to those questions, and I have a couple more. Go ahead.
I'll try to be as fast as possible and combine the response to your questions. When you talk about the effects of social media in the corpus planning, obviously we cannot deny that social media has revolutionized how we use language per se. One aspect of it is the process of democratization, right? So that itself creates a pressure on the main language actors. The other important element that we should emphasize is how social media, at least when used by youth, tend not to follow the standard variety. Social media, when people write on social media, whether it's Facebook, Twitter, and so on and so forth, I'm thinking of the youth population. It's more like a written oral language. So in cases of Angola and Mozambique, and perhaps I should speak more of the Angola that I follow more closely, you will see a lot of expressions from Kimbundu, or a lot of expressions as are originally from Kimbundu that has gone through a process of transformed into a Portuguese version, if you will. For instance, I'm thinking of Nkata, an old person. That's not a Portuguese word, but Angolans use that a lot on social media. So in a way, yes, it creates a pressure onto language planners. One wonders to what extent that political actors in Angola are actually paying attention to these youth. When we also must bear in mind that the agreement, the orthographic agreement, was crafted in the 1980s, so way before the appearance of social media. Okay, in regards to your second questions, the role of English and Chinese in Africa, Mandarin in Africa, I should say, obviously, like anywhere. English provides one, a speaker of English provides one with a lot of capital. If you are going to use a Bourdieu's term, it gives you symbolic capital, and symbolic capital can easily be transformed into economic capital. There are several studies that emphasize, for instance, how people in Angola who are fluent in English are hired by North American multinational corporations in the oil sector. So, by having that status, you can easily capitalize on it. So there's a couple of studies on that topic. The case of Mozambique is quite clear, given the historical connection with South Africa. There's mass migration of Mozambicans to South Africa that dates back to the late 19th century. And let's just keep in mind that Mozambique is part of the Commonwealth of Nations, so that English-speaking community. So that in itself tells us a lot. Some scholars emphasize that how English is a kind of unofficial language in Mozambique. It's used a lot by the political elite. In regards of Mandarin, scholars of Chinese foreign policy often emphasize how China's policy towards other regions of the world, particularly in the case of Africa, can be summarized in the expression slowly but surely. We can make the same claim in regards to language. China has built a language institute, crafted along the lines of European ones, like the British Council, Alliance Française, the Goethe Institute from Germany, and so on and so forth. The Confucius Institute, even though it was recently created, by recently, I mean back in 2004 or 5, I'm not clear, but it's in the early 2000s, has definitely made an imprint on the African continent. It has a presence in most of African states, within the Portuguese, the African states with the Portuguese as the official language. It has a presence in Cabo Verde, Angola, and Mozambique. And, and little by little, it's trying to make inroads in these countries. It is too early to make any claims whether we're going to find people in Mozambique or in Angola or in Cabo Verde being fluent in Mandarin. But certainly, Chinese government is making a lot of investment of this language institute, Confucius Institute, in these countries. Now, the last thing that I want to say in regards to Ajami, and if I want to share this with you, Matthew, because I know you're going to be fascinated with this document. So this is a document written in 1964 during the Liberation War. So I'm working. That's in Guinea-Bissau. I'm working a lot of the... Okay. Yes. And they're using Ajami, right? So I'm looking at the role of languages in political communication during the war. So obviously we can make the claim that, the relying on Ajami, it can be perceived almost like
this is Mandinka.
Yeah, you see, but obviously for even today it is classified on the archives as written in Arabic.
This is great.
You see, but it becomes a tool to transpose messages without being captured by Portuguese officials. This is from Mozambique. I'm sorry, from Guinea-Bissau. I want to suggest that we may find similar use of Ajami in northern Mozambique, given the fact that northern Mozambique was the main locus of liberation war.
This is great. So we'll be in touch. Thank you very much.
Oh, yes. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Jose, did you have anything to say about that?
Yeah, about the recognition of the language as official, I believe was part of the question.
Right.
So, as Abel pointed out, the fact that we, growing up in Mozambique, we used to actually sing some songs in Swahili. And I think this answers also the question that in part might address the question that Carol Benson is asking. But we used to sing songs in Swahili and other languages. We didn't know what they were. We don't know if it's Ajami or if it's something. But we knew that they're from the northern part of Mozambique. It was Makua, it was Makonde, it was other kinds, and Inyao, and so on. So there was this idea of speaking the languages, from the northern part of Mozambique, because that's where the liberation war really started and the interaction with Tanzania and so on. But when Mozambique became independent, towards the time of the independence, they adopted Portuguese as the only official language. So none of the stuff they were doing during the Liberation War mattered as far as language is concerned. And suddenly, we are told, forget your local languages, let's all speak Portuguese, let's all write in Portuguese because that unifies the country. So there's no official recognition of these languages because, even in Portuguese, they say dialect, which is ridiculous, but, they call them dialects, right? And so that whole Frelimo got caught up in all of that and just moved away from these local languages. But there was a conversation of possibly making Swahili an official language. There was a consideration of that. It just never was adopted as such. And so, yeah.
Thank you.
Hope that helps.
Thank you. So my question to you, Eduardo, you're not Eduardo, Jose, sorry, is about Eduardo Mondlane. So I see that you cite literature that compares him to Martin Luther King. However, you sort of apologize for the fact that the difference is that Eduardo was, supported, sort of violence as a measure for insurrection and liberation. Why use Martin Luther King in the first place? Why not just compare him to an American icon, but to Malcolm X? Why is the the scholarship, trying to fit him in a pigeonhole?
Well, in part is King is more known to Mozambicans and most of other parts of the world than Malcolm X or someone else. But there's also the parallel of education. Is that Eduardo Mondlane being a doctor, PhD sense, and having, so that was another aspect to it. And the religious aspect, King was a Christian, Mondlane was a Christian. So there were several things there that kind of really became a trigger to making that comparison. But yes, the violence part comes later. I mean, Mondlane was not for violence at first. He didn't even consider that option until much later, after interacting with, in various ways with the Portuguese and realizing that there is absolutely no way, and it wasn't just Mondlane, it's the whole group realizing that it's not going to happen. Every time we try to talk to them, there's, they just murder us, and so, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. And then to Aminah, I was really excited, telling us that Cape Verde, women have some of the highest, representations in Parliament. I think you said Parliament, right? In the legislature, in the world, certainly in Africa. And I've, read about that as well. So, I was wondering if you could sort of speak to some of the fascinating stories. I can't wait for your either article or book, to come out with the anthology of, some of those, some of the extracts were just fascinating, telling us so much about, the complexity of migration on the one hand and then gender, on the other hand. But can you link, what is clearly the, vibrancy and agency of Cape Verde women vis-a-vis compared to other African women, maybe, or maybe not. Maybe it's rooted in, African matriarchy. A lot of West African women are, mischaracterized as being, sort of weak, but they really are strong and, owners. Just tell me a little bit more about, Cape Verdean women and how they get to be, so powerful, in politics.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Kiki, for the question. I'll attempt to share a few things. One, I have to say that that accomplishment is something that I think, folks in the diaspora are very proud of. And at the same time, it has to be said that the majority of Cape Verdean women are still, facing extreme challenges, according to their social class, level of education, and other factors. But to speak to that question in particular, I do think, for me, that it is linked to the matriarchal tradition. I think that there is, on the one hand, the idea that this idea of strength, which is complicated, when you study women of African descent, it's an idea that for some informs their experiences and their accomplishments. On the other hand, it masks, patriarchal oppression and pain and trauma that have to be acknowledged. But I think that the level of accomplishment that Cape Verdean women have had in government, as well as women across the African continent, I think it has to be tied to that matriarchal tradition. And it also has to be said that there needs to be more work done to explore their educational trajectories, outside of the continent. African women, including Cape Verdean women, have achieved a certain level of success in education that probably remaining in the archipelago would not allow them to do. For example, in the realm of medicine, I know that there's a number of Cape Verdean women doctors who have been educated in Cuba, in Brazil, who have had tremendous success and have advanced medicine on the Cape Verdean islands. So I don't know if that quite answers your question, but
it does, absolutely.
Okay.
Fascinating. Thank you so much. Well, I don't have any questions in the chat box, so I'm gonna. Do any of you have questions for each other?
Actually, I have. More like to ask José Cossa if he could speak a little bit the connections between one. Eduardo Mondlane and Amílcar Cabral, and second, why Cabral was eventually asked to be one of the first to deliver the Eduardo Mondlane lecture, memorial lecture at Syracuse University in 1970.
Yeah, I mean, there was, I think, a mutual respect there because, Cabral was an intellectual, in so many ways, not only, through the Portuguese educational system or anything like that, but he was an intellectual in, even in African perspectives, ways of looking at the world through the African lenses. And I think that was part of the recognition of Securities University Africa Initiative to invite him over to speak as one of the first lecturers, because they recognized also the complexity of thought in Amílcar Cabral. As we all know, Cabral was also influential even with Paulo Freire and, and all this. He's very, so that was part of this, I think, the symbol of what an African intellectual's role should be. And I think they wanted that represented in that talk, and which he did very well. But, to us, Cabral, even in Mozambique, we, as a kid, I always looked at Amílcar Cabral as one of, apart from the cool images of Amílcar Cabral, the, hat and all that, he was the symbol of really amazing intellectualism. And so, and connected very well with the traditions, also Mozambican, the Mozambican kinds of revolt and with through poetry and all sorts of things. So he was in a way much closer to us, much well known. I don't know if that answers the question, but
yes, it does. It does. And I just want to add that, I grew up in Cabo Verde with the same imagery of Eduardo Mondlane. And I'll give you one, objective example. Back then you had one of the coins, the 10 escudo, was stamped with Eduardo Mondlane's face. So this is a person that was part of our political imaginary, if you will.
So, of course, there's the PALOP. I'm not going to use Lusophone anymore. There's the PALOP connection. But why not, Jose, think about sort of positioning, Mondlane in relation to Mandela or Kwame? What can you tell us about that?
So when I went to law school, right, and way back in the days, 1990, I think, and one of my professors was Fernando Gagnon, and he had been in the liberation struggle, was the only white person who had been in the liberation, one of the first white people to be in the liberation struggle, and a gay man, and so on. And Mondlane had been the one embracing him. So the stories Gagnon would tell us were always of this Eduardo Mondlane who always was much more of a humane person that had much broader visions, of the world. And so we didn't know at the time, there was no Nelson Mandela as the Nelson Mandela we know. Yeah. There was a Nelson Mandela who was in prison. So equating him to Mandela would not make sense at that time, right? Yeah. And so that's part of why we always looked at somebody who had lived their lives and had been, either murdered or something that through the same ideals, and that kind of interest.
Why do you think? You tell me though. But why is contemporary Mozambican politics, especially? Why are we no longer progressive? I mean, why? We had some really visionary foundational leaders. Where did all that go?
Yeah, that is a sad thing. I think Mozambique was damaged in a big way. Growing up in that era where we had, a lot of revolutionary enthusiasm with Samora Machel and other leaders, there was always a tension within Frelimo, and that was part of why Mondlane was so important, because he had a different idea about unity, about being together, and worked with people he didn't really agree with. And once he died, things just changed and became a little bit more confusing and confused and more of internal fights. And so with that division between the one group and the other group, the Marcelino dos Santos and so on, influencing Samora Machel's policy. So with that, that's a sort of Frelimo that then begins to transition slowly, gets to a place where they almost feel as if, I think, the message the country was beginning to get was the only way out of this is through, this whole other kind of like capitalism and stuff.
Yeah.
So with that, pretty much broke, everything.
Hola, somos una plataforma de diseño web llamada Dura. Así se ve nuestra plataforma. Y esto es lo que puede ofrecerle a su agencia.
And so on. And I said, this is going to be the end of our country as we know it. And indeed, it became that way. So that's why, the values changed. And now, it's a whole, and there's also a lot of secrecy within the whole history. And part of my work with Mondlane is really to unveil that secrecy, to really speak about who this human being was. He wasn't a saint, a perfect person, but he was, very much in touch with reality. And I think Mozambicans can get inspiration from that, because it's an attainable thing. It's not like, this mundane we usually hear of, that you can never become, he never had struggles, he was like a hero right away. So kind of make mundane and human beings to inspire Mozambicans to think about their own sense of humanity.
Thank you so much, Jose. Aminah has our last question. We have 5 minutes left in this panel. I see that Alicia and everybody is coming back. But Aminah, go ahead. You've got that last question.
I wrote you a question to Aminah.
Okay, while we wait for Aminah, why don't you go ahead, Anna?
Okay.
Is Aminah coming? Okay, Aminah, you have a question. And then so does Anna. And then we'll wrap up. Go ahead.
Can you repeat the question? My Wi-Fi was unstable for a minute.
Oh, I see in the chat that you have a question, Aminah.
Oh, no.
It says here that, is that Aminah?
I wrote a question that I had a question to Aminah, if it's possible.
Oh, I'm so sorry. It's Anna's question.
Right.
I am so sorry. I was misreading that. Go ahead, Anna.
Yeah, I thank you for sharing your work. I found it's very interesting, the oral history work that you're doing and also the knowledge production that you're taking part of. And as you said, I think your work is sort of correcting the patriarchal archives. And my question for you is that, for me, in my mind, Cape Verde it stands out as one of the places where women are politically represented, but also as one of the countries that I believe had the first Pride Parade in the African continent, in Mindelo, in the early 2010s. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering if you could talk to any sort of intersectionality that you see, especially among the activist movements that you're a part of.
Yes, thank you. I'm glad that you asked the question, since I didn't have an opportunity to highlight that. Poderoza has been very intentional about making sure that the work that we do is intersectional, and we have included in our conferences, as well as in our forthcoming anthology, the work of queer activists and queer people in our diaspora. So I would say that Poderoza has worked hard to recognize that as a human rights intervention, as well as a scholarly intervention. One of the members of our community is one of the co-founders of a site and a movement called Cabo Queer, for example, and Terza Silva Lima Neves has done some work in São Vicente, which is where she's from, to conduct oral histories with some of the pioneers there in that movement. And so hopefully that answers your question. And I think in general, intersectionality is a core, theme in our work. It's something that drives my work. Another aspect that relates to intersectionality is in the realm of ethnicity. For example, myself, I am Cape Verdean on my mother's side. On my father's side, I am from the Caribbean, from Barbados. And so we also acknowledge, the intersection of race and ethnicity in the diaspora, various languages and cultures that code our experiences, education levels, literacy, social class, and all the above. So thank you for that question.
And thank you. Those are famous last words. Thank you so much, José Cossa, Anna Mester, Aminah Pilgrim, and Abel Amado. Excellent panel, if I must say so myself. Excellent way to end the second day of this really fascinating conference. Thank you so much. Do not, go away. After today, come back tomorrow morning. We've got a whole full day of, more events and panels and speakers for you. But once again, thank you so much for this panel. Okay.